Welcome to the Canadian Beef Cattle Podcast, presented by the Beef Cattle Research Council. The most popular content from beefresearch.ca, available on the go. Before we get into this week's episode, a quick message from the BCRC.
Preg checking can save on winter feed costs by identifying open cows early, but it isn't always the most economical choice. In some cases, the higher prices and added weight in the spring can more than cover the costs of winter feeding. To help producers decide what's best for their operation, the Economics of Pregnancy Testing Beef Cattle model calculates the gain or loss per head when preg checking and culling open cows in the fall versus overwintering and selling them in the spring. You'll find a link to the model in the show notes. This episode features the BCRC's Science Director, Dr. Reynold Bergen.
Hi there, I'm Reynold. This Research on the Record article originally appeared in the August 2025 issue of Canadian Cattleman magazine. It's been reposted on the beefresearch.ca site with the publisher's permission. And today, we're going to talk about why it's good to keep your BVD down. So Canada's first cases of X disease were described in Saskatchewan in the summer of 1946. Eventually, that came to be known as Bovine Viral Diarrhea, or BVD. But that's really not the best name for it, because diarrhea is not actually the big problem with that disease. The biggest concerns are around abortion and infertility and the way it suppresses the immune system and kills calves. So calves that are persistently infected with BVD, or they're called PI calves, that occurs when the virus crosses over the placenta during the first 4 months of gestation before the calf is born. So when the virus does that, it's already present before that calf's immune system starts to develop. And so it doesn't recognize the BVD virus as foreign. That calf ends up being born infected, but it doesn't know it's infected. And so it never mounts a protective immune response to get rid of the virus. So now before they die, those PI calves can shed large amounts of BVD virus that can go on to infect unvaccinated cattle, and it can cause illnesses ranging from a mild fever to abortion, premature births, abortions, deformities, stunted growth, and death. Now, Cheryl Waldner and some of her collaborators at the Universities of Saskatchewan, Calgary, and Montreal recently assessed the prevalence of BVD virus in weaned beef calves and whether antibodies against BVD varied among different vaccination programs. The online version of this article links to that research paper if you want to read the details in detail. Now, in terms of what they did, so at weaning time in 2021, they collected blood samples from 20 spring-born calves in each of 107 different commercial beef herds that were participating in the Canadian cow-calf surveillance network, so coast to coast. So a total of about 2,000 calves ended up being sampled out of the over 20,000 calves that got weaned from those herds. And then the research team looked for BVD virus as well as anti-BVD antibodies in the serum. The herds that participated in this also shared their vaccination records so that the researchers could look at the relationship between how the producer vaccinated their herd and the levels of BVD virus and antibody levels in the calves. So in short, they learned that BVD vaccines work. So in the previous year, 95% of those herds had vaccinated their breeding cows against BVD, 80% had vaccinated their calves, and 27% gave their calves a second BVD vaccination, so a booster before weaning. Now, over 80% of the calves had detectable levels of antibodies against BVD, which is a statistic that's remarkably similar to the 80% of herds that had vaccinated their calves to begin with. Now, remember that those calves were sampled at weaning, and that's long after the maternal antibodies from the colostrum would have declined or disappeared from the bloodstream. And so it's almost certain that the antibodies they detected were coming from exposure to the vaccine. Those antibodies could also have been a response to natural infection with BVD, but that's pretty unlikely because only a grand total of 4 calves from 3 different herds, so 4 out of 2,000 calves out of 3 out of 100 plus herds, tested positive or suspect for BVD. So let's go into those 4 calves in more detail. So a total of 3 calves from 2 different herds were confirmed to be carrying the actual BVD virus. The 4th calf came from a 3rd herd, and it was just suspect. It's impossible to know whether those calves were persistently infected, so PI calves, or whether it was just an infection that was working its way through the system. To know that, they would have had to do a follow-up sampling a few weeks later to see if the virus was still present, in which case it would be a PI calf, or whether it had been effectively cleared by the immune system, in which case it would have been a transient infection. And they weren't able to do that resampling. But if we assume the worst case scenario, and that all 4 of those calves from all 3 of those herds were persistently infected, then the herd level prevalence across Canada would be 2.8%. So that's 3 herds that had positive or suspect calves divided by a total of 107 herds. That's where the 2.8 comes from. And the animal level prevalence across Canada would be 0.2%. So that's 4 calves divided by a total of 1,934 calves in the study. That's where the 0.2 comes from. Now, there's been other studies, older ones and smaller ones, that have reported a much higher herd and animal level prevalence of BVD. And so that suggests that BVD vaccination practices and or vaccine effectiveness have improved in Canada. So this is good news. Now, in terms of the relationship between vaccination practices and levels of the BVD virus or levels of the antibody, we're focusing on those 4 calves again, the 4 that were either known or suspected to be infected. 2 of those positive calves had never been vaccinated, but they were born in a cow herd that had been vaccinated and boosted the previous year. So those were herds that vaccinated the cows but didn't vaccinate the calves. The 3rd positive calf had been vaccinated, but it was never boosted, and it was born in a cow herd that had been vaccinated but not boosted the year before. And the BVD antibody levels were pretty low in all of the calves from both of those herds. The suspect calf came from a herd that had vaccinated their calves twice before weaning and had vaccinated the cows once. That suspect calf also had much lower levels of antibodies, anti-BVD antibodies, than the other calves from that herd. And so it could have, maybe that was a late-born calf that missed one or both of the vaccination events, or so small it escaped. These things happen. That's not the vaccine's fault. Now, when anti-BVD antibody levels were related to vaccination practices across all the calves and all the herds, the calves that had been vaccinated once or twice themselves and that had been born to cows that had also been vaccinated had much higher levels of protective antibodies than unvaccinated calves that were born to vaccinated cows. So what does this mean to you? Well, it means that vaccination controls BVD very effectively, and continued vaccination continues to control it. Low animal or herd level BVD prevalence is not a reason to stop vaccinating for BVD. So if you're already vaccinating for BVD, keep doing it. If you're not vaccinating against BVD yet, please start. If you're buying heifers to expand your herd, make sure you're quarantining them for at least 2 to 4 weeks and vaccinating them against BVD before you mix them with the rest of your herd, especially if you're unfamiliar with whether they've been vaccinated for BVD or not. Now, Canada's current measles situation illustrates why this is so important. Back in 1998, Canada declared human measles to be eliminated. So not eradicated, but eliminated, because vaccination rates were high enough and case numbers were low enough that the virus couldn't spread easily. Recently, those numbers have really gone up. The number of Canadian measles cases went from 12 2 years ago to 147 last year to 4,548 by the end of July. Now, over 90% of those current measles cases are people who haven't been vaccinated against measles or just don't know whether they were vaccinated or not. So the same thing could happen with BVD if we take our eyes off the ball. And that would have very costly consequences for individual producers, for their herds, and for the overall industry. So the bottom line is that now is a really good time to talk to your veterinarian to review your herd health program and ensure that the vaccines you're using and how you store them and how you handle them and which cattle you're giving them to and when you're giving them is still appropriate. Before I go, I would like to remind you that the BCRC has an online survey open to help set Canada's forage, cattle, and beef research priorities for the next 5 years. If you have already done our survey, thank you very much. But if you haven't, please go to beefresearch.ca and look under the heading at the top that says Posts and Multimedia. Scroll down to the June 4th post, and please lend us 15 minutes to help us focus how your checkoff research dollars get invested. That survey is going to be open until September 4th, so it's closing pretty soon. So thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you again next time.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. You can find all relevant links and information at beefresearch.ca or in the show notes. The Beef Cattle Research Council is funded by the Canadian Beef Cattle Checkoff and strives for excellence in the production of Canadian beef, cattle, and forage through research, innovation, and extension. Tune in every Tuesday as the Canadian Beef Cattle Podcast delivers straightforward insights, expert information, and a wealth of practical knowledge for Canadian beef producers. Subscribe now.